Well, thank you for the introduction. I don't think I could introduce myself any better than that. So we're just going to keep moving forward, I think. So this talk is going to be about unique species of the Palouse, um, kind of revolving around the topics of endemism and conservation. And we're going to get a lot more into what that means and what that actually looks like in our world. So we've got a little overview here of the topics that I'm going to be discussing tonight. We're going to go through a maybe needlessly exhaustive overview of what endemic species actually are, but I think it's an important topic to actually define. So that we're all actually talking about the same thing, because endemic species mean different things to different people. Then we're going to go through what you're all really here for, which are endemic species of the Palouse. And then based on what we discover with those species, we're going to go into conservation implications for not only endemic species on the Palouse, but also endemic species at large. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about endemism? The definition that I've taken from there's a really great channel on YouTube called All About Nature, and they had a video about endemism recently, and I really liked their definition, which is the state of a species or organism being native and restricted to a single specific geographic location, such as an island, country. I guess you could have an island, country, or a habitat. And so an example of that, there's ones that are easier to point to than others. In New Zealand, on the South Island of New Zealand, you have the great spotted kiwi, only found on the South Island of New Zealand. In Australia, you have the platypus, only endemic to Australia and Tasmania as well. But endemic species, I've found in conversation with people, I've found that those examples of species that are extremely restricted to places where we can very visually see that restriction, that's kind of more of what they think of. But we can take a species like the black-footed ferret, for instance, which is formerly endemic to the Great Plains of North America. That's not a single specific, it's not as easy to define of an area. It's a little more nebulous, but we would still consider that an endemic species to the Great Plains. And then another example of that, selfishly, that I kind of put in because I have a lot of history with the Gunnison sage grouse being from Colorado. We have the Gunnison sage grouse. So we would say that it is endemic to sagebrush ecosystems in Colorado and Utah. It's not enough to just say that it's only endemic to Colorado. It is endemic to a habitat type. So the final word on endemism, I don't know if it needs to be said, but I have gotten into debates with people about this, is every species is technically endemic to somewhere, because by definition, to have a species being endemic, it's used in the context of that geographic range or that habitat type. So, for example, Canada thistle, one of our worst invasive species, is endemic to, you guessed it, Eurasia, which is that's something that maybe I'll get into a little bit more. But if there's anything that you should come away from this talk with, it's that don't trust common names. I don't want to catch you doing that. So that was the final word. However, in conservation, the term endemic species kind of has this connotation of those species that have a very restrictive habitat or geographic range. Because in conservation, when we're talking about an endemic species, that's where our efforts are kind of more focused into those habitats that are more restrictive, those ranges that are more isolated. So the Olympic marmot is a good example of that, only endemic to the Olympic Peninsula. So hopefully that makes sense. So I will have a disclaimer here. I'm not the most qualified person in the world to be talking about this. I'm not a botanist. I'm not an ecologist. I'm just a restorationist by trade. But my passion and my interest for endemic species really goes back a long way. And it goes back to the very beginning of when I became interested in conservation. So I'll share a little bit of that here. So in fourth grade, in the grand old year of 2009. I had a class project that was all about national parks research, and so each student had to choose a national park that they wanted to research everything about. And so, being a fourth grader that looks like that and is a crazy little kid, I thought Death Valley has the coolest national park name. So, I'm definitely going to go for that. It's a claim I would still support, although Gates of the Arctic is a pretty great national park name as well. And so learning about this crazy place that, it's the hottest place on earth, and there's stones that can walk, and it's lower than sea level. I learned about these fish that live in this super dry environment, and they were called pupfish. And I specifically learned about a species of pupfish that is not endemic to Death Valley, but it's endemic in the region, which was the devil's hole pupfish. And the very interesting thing about the devil's hole pupfish is that not only is it endemic to just the state of Nevada, not only is it endemic to just the Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, it is endemic to this puddle, and not only that, it's only endemic to this little, you can kind of see a little shallow shelf in this partially flooded cave. That is the only place in the world where this fish exists. That's it. And so what that did to that little crazy kid who didn't know anything about anything at the time was pretty much this. That really was the first moment where I became aware of the kind of fragility of nature, and 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 it was because I started feeling that weight that I became a conservationist. I became interested in conservation. I became more interested in getting outside. And that led, to all of my educational opportunities, and then to what I do for a career today. So I really owe all of that to learning about endemic species and learning about the conservation obstacles, I guess, that a lot of these endemic species can face. So, to go towards endemic species of the Palouse, I have a little motto that I like to say when we're talking about the relationship between, topography, geography, speciation, how things develop. And it's that places shape species. And the Palouse is a very, ideally, a lot of you are from the Palouse, but if you're not, the Palouse has some extremely unique topographical, climatic, and geological components. And because of that, there are niches or different roles that are unique to this unique environment. And so, to fill those different roles, species will evolve in order to, essentially exploit an open door in an ecosystem. And so, that process over time will create species that are endemic to a certain place. So we're going to go back into the Palouse again, just in case. I know there are some people maybe who are not from here at all and don't know anything about the Palouse. So we'll go into a little bit of that, because when you say the Palouse, much like endemic species, people tend to be talking about different things. The regional boundaries are actually highly debated. You can see in this image here, which is from the Palouse Prairie Foundation. There's sort of a proposed core area, and then, depending on who you talk to, people can say that it goes all the way to Pendleton, all the way to Spokane, or not. So I think for the purpose of this, I'm going to be more or less going on this illustration here when defining the Palouse. So that core does exist in Whitman, Spokane, and Latah counties. Geologically, you have the loess, the wind-blown soils, wind-blown glacial soils that are a result of glaciation, and the Missoula floods, which are a whole thing that I don't have nearly enough time to get into. But it's created these rolling hills of very deep, rich soil. You have a cold, semi-arid climate. And all of those factors, evolving in tandem, have created this ground that has created some of the best agricultural land, definitely in the country and probably in the world. Um, but before it was that, it was this former range of these particularly unique grassland ecosystems, and collectively we know these as Palouse Prairie, which is unique in the realm of prairie ecosystems because it's a bunch grass prairie ecosystem. You have species like blue bunch wheatgrass and Idaho fescue. These are very different species than the tall grass or the short grass prairies that we see further east. But it also has these very unique forb. Or so when I started this job, I didn't even know what a forb was. A forb is a flowering herbaceous plant. Flowers for lack of a better word. But it has some forb, shrub, and tree components that we see coming up again and again and again that are consistent enough where we can say that's what the Palouse community, the Palouse Prairie community type is. And now, because of the fact that this region is such possesses such great agricultural ground, that Palouse Prairie ecosystem now only exists in very sparse remnants. And in a lot of cases, these were hillsides, buttes, the tops of buttes, or what we call eyebrows, which are areas in an agricultural field where you see this like kind of thick strip of land where you're like, that's not wheat, that's not those aren't garbanzo beans. There's a little strip of native vegetation, for whatever reason, maybe it was like too steep or too rocky to plow, but it looks like Martin Scorsese sitting up on the hillside with his big eyebrows. And another one, which is one that I found particularly interesting when I came here, were cemeteries. So places with a sociocultural component, places where it was sacrilegious to plow that ground away. And now, ironically, those are some of the highest quality prairie remnants that we have. Now, the statistic that everybody likes to throw around with this, and it's a startling one, so I don't blame them, is that less than 1% of that Palouse Prairie survives in what we can assume is its original range. And because of that, it is commonly cited as one of the most endangered ecosystems in the US. So if we're thinking about how places like the Palouse shape species, the Palouse shapes a certain amount of species in a certain way and creates these endemic species. Now, if the environment becomes endangered, what happens to those endemic species? And so that brings us to what I'm sure you're all here for, which are some of these really unique endemic species to the Palouse. So one of the most significant ones, and maybe the only one of these that I've had a lot of personal experience with, is Spalding's catchfly, Silene spaldingii. Now, this one kind of gets a lot of the headline attention because it's, as far as I know, the only Palouse endemic that is federally listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, which is a very significant piece of legislation. It's one of the only pieces of government legislation that actually has teeth, really. So to have it listed under ESA is extremely significant. Now, to say that Spalding's catchfly is endemic to just the Palouse is a little misleading, but it would be a little more accurate to say that it's endemic to this kind of broader network of inland Northwest grasslands. And in fact, the largest population of Spalding's catchfly that we know of is not even on the Palouse. It's in the Zumwalt Prairie in Oregon, which is a very similar bunchgrass prairie ecosystem. So, prior to widespread land conversion, there was this kind of patchwork, interconnected network of prairie across the Northwest, and so Spalding's catchfly is endemic to that. We will go over species that have much more restrictive ranges later, but this is kind of starting with the broadest possible one. I'll go through a little bit of a description with it. It's a multi-stemmed perennial. It comes back year after year, 8 to 24 inches in height. I've personally seen ones that were a little taller because they were growing in some very like kind of densely forested, very shady areas, and they got a little bit taller, but then they fell over, which was kind of sad. Um, and they possess an extremely sticky texture, which is gives it the name catchfly. It's a little like if you get like honey on your fingers, and after a while, they really you trying to struggle to pull them apart. It's really like that. It's extremely sticky. Now, as far as why it does that, I don't know if anybody really knows. Um, to me personally, it seems like kind of a poor way to treat your pollinators, to catch them and trap them. But if there's any botanists who know a little bit more about it than I am, who could shed some light on that, I definitely welcome the comment. Um, Now, going back to it being federally listed, it had a federal review in 2021 to see if the current conditions warranted unlisting it, if it had made enough recovery. And it was not delisted. In 2021, trends were generally going up as far as the number of individuals that were being surveyed across populations. There's a new review in 2026, which I was a part of, and I don't know how much I can officially say about it, but I will leave it at it will not be being delisted. It will not be. But that's not to make anyone give up hope that it may happen someday. Um, to go back to some of what we're seeing on the Palouse, and specifically within the Palouse Conservation District for Spaldings, I was part of the group that we had identified a couple of different sites where Spaldings was occurring, and we were doing some work trying to actually plant, specimens there and trying to see, how they were spreading out and what the trends were and how it was kind of how they were responding to different, environmental factors. And so as a result of that research, in 2023, when I first started doing it, we had 25 specimens recorded across 3 different sites within the boundaries of the Palouse Conservation District. And then the next year, when we went to go survey, we had 61, which was, I thought, a tremendous success. It may have mostly been due to the fact that between those 2 years, I became a lot better at identifying what Spalding's catchfly actually was. So, I plead the fifth on whether or not I could have missed some in that first year. But I would say that within the Palouse Conservation District, we're definitely seeing the trend going upward with populations of Spalding's catchfly. Now, I love iNaturalist. I know we've definitely tried to get people more involved with using iNaturalist. So for all these species, I took a little bit of data from there just to see, just to kind of communicate what the distribution of these species are and how numerous they are in the places where they're occurring. And so on iNaturalist, Spalding's catchfly has a total of 102 observations. Now, that may sound like a lot, but for context, some of our other big Palouse Prairie natives, not endemics because they occur other places, but arrowleaf balsam root is one of our big species that has more than 20,000 observations. Prairie smoke has more than 19,000, and sticky geranium has more than 12,000. So for Spalding's catchfly to have only 102, and there's probably some watching this, but iNaturalist, botanist people, they really take this seriously. For there only to be 102 observations, that's pretty stark. And so the status of it being threatened, I think, is certainly justified. Now, the next one, I had seen a couple of people putting in the chat. I know David Hall for sure was saying that this was their favorite Palouse native. And I'm inclined to agree with him. The broadfruit Mariposa lily. Now, this one is endemic to Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. Like I said, more of that. It is the Palouse Prairie ecosystem, but once you get more into Oregon, maybe or maybe not, it's kind of part of that broader network of inland Northwest prairies. But it's certainly endemic to the Palouse. We found quite a few here. It's a perennial forb, flowering herbaceous plant. Comes from a bulb, 8 to 16 inches in height. I've never personally seen one. That's one of my big goals in anything that I do here is I'd very much like to see one someday in person. It's got these really, really intense kind of lavender petals with this odd kind of crescent shape at the base with yellow. It's very distinct. Um, what I thought was interesting is that they're most often found near roads, which is something that we actually see a lot with a lot of these species because roads tend to be built, or sorry, roads within their kind of immediate environment tend to be the lowest point in that area. And so water always goes to the lowest point. Um, Additionally, for roads, there's a lot of vegetation clearing, which reduces potential competition for these species. So a lot of them are found by roads. A lot of these very rare species are. Now it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because that's a great environment if nobody's using the road, and if roads are one of the biggest threats to these species as well, which is something that we'll see a little bit more of later. Historically, they occupied low meadows of the Palouse, and 68 observations on iNaturalist. So if we're talking about the last Spalding's catchfly was threatened, this has been officially designated as a rare. I think in Idaho and Washington at least. But I thought the distribution patterns for this one were really interesting. You have that kind of core area, almost more a little south of Lewiston, and then you have one way out by Salmon. So who knows how that got out there? Who knows if that's some part of some remnant population? Plant distribution is very odd and unpredictable. So even if a species does have a very restrictive, we think we have it pinned down to this very restrictive, it's only in the Palouse Prairie, and then you find one way out in the middle of Idaho. It's like, well, how did that get there? So I thought that was really interesting to see. But yeah, this species is certainly very rare. Palouse thistle. This is maybe one of the more interesting ones to me. Washington, Idaho, Oregon, again. Perennial forb from rhizomes. It spreads rhizomatously through its roots, coming up, this. 12 to 39 inches in height. The flower heads, I've actually had quite a few people speak to me, concerned that like, oh, we hate Canada thistle so much, but how am I know about this Palouse thistle. What am I going to do if the scene in the movie where it's like the villain and like a clone, and the clone is like, no, don't shoot me. He's the clone. Anyway, it's a little bit like that is what I think people worry about with the Palouse thistle. And judging by the images here, you got nothing to worry about. It's pretty distinct. These white flower heads, about an inch and a half long. They've got this really kind of intricate, like artichoke wrapping of the bracts at the bottom of the flower head. Very coarse tooth leaves, also very long, 6 to 12 inches. Green on top and then white woolly undersides. Now, thistle is sort of a bad word, but this is a non-invasive one. It doesn't spread very easily, obviously. And to me, it's interesting that it's occupying it. If this environment, if the Palouse Prairie was entirely untouched, whatever that means, and we'll get into that. There's still a niche or a role within that environment for weeds. But native weeds are still natives. Just because it's a weed, it doesn't mean that, it's invasive and it has to be, snuffed out. Native weeds are still natives. So Palouse thistle was really important for me when I first moved up here, to kind of realize that there's a little more nuance in that conversation about weeds. Now, invasive weeds are bad, obviously, but I thought that the term native weed was kind of an oxymoron. So this is an important species for me. It really taught me a lot. 47 observations on iNaturalist. So we're just going further and further down. This one I think did have one of the wider distributions though, going all the way out to Moses Lake, up into the Colville National Forest, and then down even like past Grangeville. But you can see that there is kind of a core, that core again of like, Whitman County, Latah County. This is very rare. This is a very rare species. 47 observations on iNaturalist. That's very rare. Palouse milk vetch. This is arguably the one that I know the least about. I had to really consult the Palouse Prairie Field Guide for any information on this one because there just didn't seem to be that much in existence. But as far as I know, this is one of the ones with the most restrictive range, only in Washington and Idaho, only in those areas that we really consider to be the core of the Palouse Prairie. It's a perennial forb, once again, with a deep woody taproot. Um, uh, Almost all of these species have that in common, and that's something that places shape plants. A lot of those species have that deep woody taproot because we are a cold, semi-arid environment where water is only available for parts of the year, small parts of the year. And so when you have that deep woody taproot, it's able to draw a lot of the moisture up, from further down. Um, so that's a kind of common thread we see with a lot of our Palouse Prairie endemics is they've all kind of independently involved that because that's the best way to function in this environment. 12 to 20 inches in height. It's got these clusters of I've seen anywhere from 15 to 35 flowers with separate flowers along the central stem. Something I thought was interesting about it is that it's a legume. It's in the same family as beans and peas, and so because of that, it's nitrogen fixing. And for anybody that doesn't know what that means, is that legumes are able to take atmospheric nitrogen. So, the atmosphere is 70, I don't know, 8% nitrogen, something like that. It's able to take that atmospheric nitrogen out of the air and convert it into a form that is physically able to be used by plants. And so those are extremely important species, especially in the context of soil restoration. Because nitrogen is an extremely important soil nutrient component. 24 observations on iNaturalist. This is really rare. I'd encourage anybody to get out there and try and boost these numbers a little bit because they're starting to look pretty bleak. Jessica's aster. This one I actually have seen in person. Only Washington and Idaho, once again. Average 1 meter tall, perennial from rhizome. Once again, rhizome spreading through roots. This one I found, the history of it I think is really interesting because apparently it only occurred mostly on private lands. And so because of that, there really wasn't a lot known about the distribution of it until the early 90s. Just because, when you have species that are only on private land, it's not like you're going to have much opportunity, as an agency to really get in there and try and look. So it wasn't until the kind of early to mid 90s that we really knew anything about where Jessica's aster was. Now we know that it really favors this kind of dry forest habitat on like the river breaklands. You can see a lot. There's definitely more kind of in that like core Palouse area that we're really considering. Although there's one by Kamei, and I did a little digging into that sighting, and it was legit. So once again, who knows how that got there? But luckily, the distribution isn't maybe as restrictive as we thought it was. 20 observations on iNaturalist. This is exceedingly rare. Palouse goldenweed, Washington, Idaho, extreme northeast Oregon. This one to me was the clearest in terms of the iNaturalist observations. This was like the clearest, like this is a Palouse endemic. It is only here. Except for, there's some down in Grangeville, there's one up in Spokane, but other than that, it's like just in Whitman and Latah County. Flowering herb, once again, growing from that deep taproot. That's an environmental adaptation for living here. up to 28 inches in height. The Palouse Prairie Field Guide on this one, once again, I don't know too much about this one to be honest, but the Palouse Prairie Field Guide was helping me out. Apparently, it was once a dominant plant on the Palouse. Now, we'll get into this a little bit, but I'm not sure exactly how they know that because there's very little information about what the Palouse Prairie was like prior to widespread conversion to agriculture. We can argue that as much as we want, and I think I have a slide about that later. But it really, I think that's kind of just a best guess. Now on iNaturalist, I will say I mentioned these two sightings that are way up north in Spokane and then way down by Grangeville. Those two sightings are currently being kind of debated, the validity on them. So there's somewhere between 15 and 19 observations of this on iNaturalist. Now, in the scientific community, this is what we call stupidly rare. Between 15 and 19 observations, that's nothing. Now, this is my favorite one personally, and maybe the only one that I also have really extensive experience with. The giant Palouse earthworm, Drillolaris americanus. Once again, one that we don't really have a lot of information about, but the information that we do have is very interesting. Presumably just from Washington and Idaho. First described in 1897 in Pullman by a naturalist from WSU named Frank Smith, I believe his name was. And then after that when it was described, Frank Smith said, "Oh, they're everywhere. They're numerous across the Palouse." And then immediately after that, nobody ever saw one again, all the way until. So who knows what happened there? But that period of almost 100 years where nobody knew anything about it. It was just described once, and in the description it said it was 3 feet long. It's albino. It smells like lilies. It spits at you. It sort of created this kind of legendary status. And then an entomologist from U of I named Ding Johnson, who's a friend of mine, rediscovered it back in the 1980s up on, I think, by Idler's Rest, actually. And then there was another big gap where we thought it was extinct again. And then a lot of work was done kind of in the mid to late 2000s by Jody Johnson Maynard from U of I, Unaria Sanchez de Leon, and some other people from WSU. Did a lot of work to confirm that it was still around. And so their efforts have yielded some interesting data. Now, far from the 3 foot long mythical status of this giant worm, you think like Dune. It's probably the ones that we found have only ever been between about 6 to 18 inches, which is still quite a bit for a worm, but it's not the kind of there's worms in South America that are probably more of what you're thinking of, where they're huge and massive, and there's the Australian ones. Jody Johnson Maynard from U of I frequently jokingly said that it should be called the slightly larger than average Palouse earthworm, just to try and temper people's expectations a little more realistically. But like I said, we know a little bit more about it now. It lives in these deep vertical burrows. So there's 3 classes of earthworm, and they're divided based on their burrowing habits. There's anecic, 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 and these are the vertically burrowing ones. And then there's endogeic, which means they burrow horizontally. And then there's epigeic, which means they don't burrow at all. They're just like, I'm free. They're way up on the top. Now, the recent specimens, so all the specimens in the past had only been found in this core Palouse Prairie range, like right around Pullman, Smoot Hill, Idler's Rest, that kind of thing. And then I think about 10 years ago, there was actually one found near Ellensburg, right along the Cascades. So that complicates things a bit. We can only assume so much because there's so few that have ever been discovered. But knowing that their range could possibly extend out that far, that definitely changes things as far as assumptions that we have to make. Now, we're going to play by the same rules as all the other ones. This is cheating a little bit, but zero observations on iNaturalist, which is not surprising. But there have been less than 25 observations all time. This species has been seen by human eyes less than 25 times in the past 200 years. So ludicrously rare is what we would call that in the scientific community. Now, with a species that is that rare, or so so it seems, the obvious question then is, well, why can't we list that under the Endangered Species Act like we did with Spalding's catchfly? Spalding's catchfly wasn't ludicrously rare; it wasn't stupidly rare. Why does that one get to go? And in fact, it was attempted to be listed twice. There were petitions in 2005, and then in the kind of mid 2000s, and then maybe kind of like 5 or so years later. And it was rejected both times. And the reason for that, in the ugly catch-22 of conservation, that there wasn't enough data to support that it was ludicrously rare. So that catch-22, like I was saying, it's clearly it's so rare that you're not able to gather information on it. But then because you don't have that information, they can't make an informed decision about how rare it actually is. So I haven't heard of any efforts recently to try and petition to relist this. Yeah, I want to say the last time was during the Bush administration. So it's been a while. So if anybody wants to go out and collect more data on the species so that maybe it may be listed by ESA someday, that's an excellent rainy day project. So if places shape species, which is the central idea of endemism, what happens when places change? So I'll give an example of this. In Texas, I took this example from a botanist on YouTube. His channel name is Crime Pays, but Botany doesn't. He's this kind of foul-mouthed Chicago gangster type, but he's like really into plants. He's a great guy. He was down in Texas trying to chart the recovery of this species called the prostrate milkweed, which, going back to our scientific terminology, you would consider stupidly rare. Endemic to the thorn scrub of South Texas and northern Tamaulipas in Mexico, only known from a handful of sites, I think less than 10. And one of the most significant sites that the prostrate milkweed was being recorded at was along this roadside. Like I said, these roads are kind of at the low spot in their environment. They collect a lot of water, gives plants a lot of sun, decreases competition. And so the largest population of prostrate milkweeds in the world was growing along this one roadside. And somebody didn't tell that to whoever was regrading the roads. And during one road regrade, they destroyed all but one of these stupidly rare plants. So that is not an example that shouldn't be taken as being indicative of the overall state of Palouse Prairie or anything like that. It's just an example of when you have a species that is so restricted by range or habitat type, any small change, no matter how small, in that environment will impact it in some way. And that brings us to the conservation implications for endemic species. Endemic species are across the board at disproportionately higher risk for extinction because of what I was just talking about. Now the threats are coming at them from all angles. There's competition from invasive non-native plants. You have problems with small isolated populations on the genetic side. When you don't have enough genetic diversity in a population, that can also cause a population to collapse. You have fire regime changes, land conversion, something that is a big deal in the Palouse, chemical exposure, another big thing. At some of the prairie remnants that I've been working with, we like to plant sort of like buffers of trees that can kind of like take the hit of herbicides from nearby agricultural fields so that that herbicide doesn't drift into these more sensitive, prairie remnants. You have grazing and damage from livestock, off-road vehicle use, which has been a big concern with Palouse prairie remnants out at McCroskey State Park, for example, insect damage and disease, and then climatic changes. Climate change is can kind of fit into all of those in some way. So, as you probably saw, Palouse endemics largely are rare. Their populations are declining, or both. And so, from our view as a conservationist, we have to consider, okay, these plants are and animals with the giant Palouse earthworm are part of a interconnected web of plants and animals, and not to mention fungi. I mean, that's like a total blind spot to me. And insects. It's part of these interconnected communities. So we have to consider what happens when these species are altered, or in some cases extirpated, or driven out of an environment. How does that impact all of the other components within that ecosystem? Um, and the kind of sobering reality with conservation for endemics is that there are no second chances. Once it's gone, it's gone. Um, with a lot of species that aren't endemic, you have the ability to say, oh, if this population is extirpated, driven out, or ceases to exist in a certain environment, we at least have it somewhere else. But with endemic species, you don't have a second chance. So that's why we take it really seriously. Now, I was having a conversation recently with a couple of people who were involved with Palouse Prairie. And we got into the topic of species. Let's see, how do I put it? So I was asked, why are endemic species really important? And I said, because they belong here. And I expanded on that. They've evolved into this very specific system, and there's abiotic and biotic components to that. And somebody that I was talking with was like, well, don't forget the human component of this, with indigenous peoples. And that was a blind spot that I had to recognize, that I had to kind of reckon with, because I had been looking at endemic species from my very kind of overtly scientific perspective, but I think there's also a sociocultural perspective that they need to be looked at with. And I think that conservation for endemic species not only is important from the perspective of preserving biodiversity and everything, but it's also important in preserving sociocultural heritage and that sovereignty. Traditional ecological knowledge is also a big part of that. When we consider that these species have been shaped in different ways, not only by their environment, but also by the people that occupied them. So going back to the idea that places shape plants, I sort of followed this idea and I thought, well, plants then can kind of shape people. Speaking of, thinking about camas, for example, plants shape people. They shape, people's distribution, they shape their habits, diets. Well, if we follow that further, people then ultimately end up shaping plants, with camas meadows and prescribed burning. And then plants ultimately shape places. Um, there's very obvious, ecological kind of environmental footprints that we can tell where camas, operates in a certain way in different environments. And so I thought the more I thought about it, you kind of have this cycle. Places shape plants, shape people, shape plants, shape place. And when I started thinking of it that way, the phrase "they belong here," I think really kind of took on a different meaning to me. So I think that that can sometimes be a little bit of a blind spot in the conservation world. But thinking about the sociocultural, the human dynamic of endemic species, I think is a very important thing to think about as well. Now, land use implications for endemics. This is sort of a kind of a broader idea of like, well, what do we do? That's the important question, right? So areas of native habitat are insane wells of biodiversity. And because we have these biodiversity kind of hotspots, in a lot of cases, they may be prioritized for protection legally. You can have a natural area preserve like Steptoe Butte, for example, which the photos that I had of Spalding's catchfly were all from Steptoe Butte. Working land adjacent to prairie remnants may be able to have buffers installed. Like I said, trees are usually trees or shrubs, which can kind of take the brunt of pesticides and herbicides drifting in from agricultural operations. Land use regimes could increase or decrease habitat fragmentation. Now, when I say fragmentation, that just means, you have little piecemeal bits of Palouse prairie habitat spread out across an area. And it's all up to us to decide what we want to do with that land and whether or not we want to increase or decrease that fragmentation. Restoration regimes, this is what we, deal with day in and day out. Trying to highlight, trying to target a specific bit of land for conservation, and then working through that process for years and sometimes decades. The bottom line with it is that land managers have a great deal of power in determining what happens to endemic species. And as I hope that I've showed, small actions, things that are so small we don't even think about them, can have big impacts for endemics. So I hate to say that it's all up to us because it's not really, but a lot of it is, and we do have the ability to choose how our actions are going to influence these species. So what to do? That's the $6 million question tonight, and always in conservation. What you can do is there's actually a lot that you can do. You can consult local resources to learn more about endemic species. I mean, you're already here listening to some guy who's barely qualified to speak the English language, let alone tell you about endemic species. Talk about this, and so you've already made the first step right there. You have conservation districts in Whitman County and in Latah County. There's nonprofit organizations like the Palouse Prairie Foundation or the Phoenix Conservancy. You have native plant societies. I'm a member of the Idaho Native Plant Society, and we welcome members from Whitman County as well. Get outside. I hope that this has been a good advertisement for iNaturalist. I love it. And I hope that I've shown that even, going out and just clicking a picture of Palouse goldenweed, I mean, that can really influence what we know about these rare species. So iNaturalist is a great way for citizen scientists to get involved in this. Some protected areas have maintenance days that are open to the public or open to people that are involved in different, organizations. There's what I like to call ex situ conservation. So in situ conservation would be conservation happening on the ground in these prairie remnants. Ex situ conservation would be happening elsewhere. And that can involve restoring land or reverting it back to Palouse Prairie. Now, legally, I think I have to say that removing parts of any species listed, by the Endangered Species Act can be a federal offense, and those parts include seeds. So just do your due diligence with that. It's generally advised not to collect seeds from Palouse prairie remnants because those populations are fragile enough as it is, and they're not exactly stable. So instead of that, you can consult local and regional seed producers. We have a number of them. Even just in Pullman, we have some pretty brilliant native plant nurseries in the region that I can personally attest have really great stock of forbs and shrubs and trees. I mean, it's what we use at the Palouse Conservation District for all of our plantings. Now, if you care enough about it, you can go to the level of changing policies. I think that there are a lot of on the legislative side, I think there are some blind spots to endemic species just because maybe sometimes they don't have enough of a voice. And so, any kind of passionate advocacy, I think, can really be effective in just getting any kind of protection for these. And then creating and joining communities. Creating communities is a little bit harder because you have to do it all yourself. But there are lots of communities already of people who are really enthusiastic about this and really care. And even in just the little bit of experience I've had with kind of dipping my toe into a lot of the communities that are here that really care about Palouse Prairie and native plants. It's really changed the way that I've seen things, and it's really kind of altered my priorities into making this, really affirming that this is my life's mission. So I really encourage anybody who's interested in doing that. Just look around. There's lots of other people that care. And on that note, I wanted to share this photo of Elkhorn Clarkia pulchella, that I found in the middle of an ag field that was full of weeds. This was growing out all on its own. Don't know how it got there, but this is it's not necessarily endemic to just the Palouse, but it is endemic to the Palouse. It's a Palouse prairie native growing in the last place you'd expect, and so it's easy to catastrophize and to get very down about the way that things may be going, or the way that things are in a lot of cases for endemic species of the Palouse. But this is what hope looks like. If you just give it a chance, it will flower and it will grow. And I believe that we can learn a lot from these plants, and specifically this little flower here.